Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. Today we're actually doing something really fun. We're reading a tweet that actually Philip Goff, Dr. Philip Goff, he's a philosopher over at Durham University. His research focuses on how to integrate consciousness into our scientific worldview. And apparently he spends way too much time arguing on Twitter. And this is actually what we're doing today is we're looking at a tweet that he posted that I thought was like it'd be super fun to just talk to him about this tweet. So let me just go ahead and put it up on the screen, okay? I'll put it up on the screen, I'll read it out, and then we'll have a chat about it. All right, so here it is. The theist is in denial about suffering. The atheist is in denial about fine-tuning. The endless ideological war between these two factions is preventing us finding a theory that can accommodate both of these data. I just thought, I mean, I feel like first of all, it should have way more than 117 likes or however, I don't know how much it is now, but it should have a whole lot more. I just thought that it was so interesting to think about. And because I mean, that is kind of like something that I've wondered. It's like, are theists really like not taking the problem of evil seriously enough? But then I also think like I've already thought that atheists aren't taking the fine tuning argument seriously enough. And so seeing your tweet was kind of just like, affirming some independent thoughts that I've had myself. But yeah, tell me more about like some of the idea behind the tweet. Why did you decide to tweet this? You know, what is some other work that can maybe tie it in here as well? So
Yeah, I guess, I mean, firstly, thanks for having me on, by the way, Cameron. Good to speak to you again. Firstly, I suppose I was being a little bit provocative. I think there are some great philosophers, on the one hand, trying to diffuse the fine-tuning argument, on the other hand, trying to respond to the problem of evil, and these are very deep, difficult questions. I suppose my point was just to draw attention to the fact that I think there is, a lot of cultural baggage, a lot of cultural ideology stopping us making progress, stopping free inquiry in this area. On the face of it, we do have what looks like pretty strong evidence for some kind of cosmic teleology, some kind of purpose in the universe. On the other hand, we have what looks like a pretty strong evidence against the traditional idea of God, and people tend to think they have to deny one of these. But actually, I mean, I first came to this actually teaching philosophy of religion, starting off with all the arguments against God, starting off with all the arguments for God, starting off with all the arguments against, and thinking, actually, these aren't inconsistent. These both look like pretty damn good arguments, and you can have it all. You can have your cake and eat it. And very, very few people take that option, I think, because, we get stuck in these dichotomies like US capitalism versus Soviet communism, or, materialism versus dualism, or, you get stuck in these dichotomies, and it's just a huge middle ground of options there that are just not really explored at all.
Yeah, so let me say this. We are going to do some Q&A with Dr. Goff. So if you have a question for him, feel free to leave it in the live chat. If you want to send it as a super chat, it's a way to guarantee that your question will be asked today. But I wanted to let me pull the tweet back up on the screen real quick, and we'll go through like each individual part of the tweet. So the first part is the theist is in denial about suffering, and put like the language, about denial. Let's put that aside. Let's just focus on why you think that suffering is like a really, a serious problem for and I want to say it's a problem for like perfect being theists. So it's not necessarily a problem for theists in general, someone who just believes that some type of God exists, but it is a problem for like a perfect being theist. So we'll take each part of the tweet one at a time, and then because the part that I really want to focus on, as a theist, as a Christian, is the part about fine tuning. But let's focus on that first part of the tweet. We shouldn't ignore that part, because I think it's really important to like your overall thesis, which is like you're trying to find a synthesis, that makes sense of all the data. And I think that there's a lot of value in that. So, but tell me why you think, flesh that part of the tweet out a little bit more.
Yeah. So, I mean, and just to say, actually, you're trying to cover both sides of this, but I mean, there's been a great reaction both from theists and from atheists on Twitter. I suppose the tweet annoyed everybody. So yeah, I'm going to be having a similar discussion on the Real Atheology podcast So just to show there's no bias towards either side of this debate. But yeah, on the first part, we're familiar with the Bayesian ways of thinking about evidence. We think about a hypothesis. We think, how would you expect the world to be on that hypothesis? And I think thinking about, as you say, I totally agree. This is really something aimed at perfect being theology, or the idea of the omni-God, the all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good being. Think about what the universe would look like if it were created by such a being. Would we have come into existence through the long, torturous process of natural selection, survival of the fittest, animals tearing each other apart? Would you have such grotesque suffering in nature, like animals that paralyze their prey and eat it alive for days? Would we get old and have bodies that fall apart and die? Would God's existence be so difficult to access for so many people? On the face of it, this just looks like not the kind of data you'd expect given perfect being theism. And I mean, the way I like to put it ultimately is I take that the proposition that it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to create a universe like this. I think that is a pretty solid moral intuition there. Not infallible. Maybe there are some reasons that we can't access that explain why God creates suffering, allows suffering to happen. But, all we can ever do is reason as best we can. And I think that is as solid a moral intuition as you can get. And it does seem to rule out the omni-God.
Well, what about some of the more common responses to the problem of evil? Why do you think that those just aren't good enough? Because I mean, ultimately, you do think that the perfect being theist is they're not. Yeah, they're in some kind of bad epistemic situation here. So what about the standard responses, like say free will, soul building? Some of the more common responses to suffering in the world that try to marry the badness that we see in the world, but also marry that with the perfect being who knows all the facts, and that these some of the suffering in the world could serve these greater purposes, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, free will. I guess I have the familiar view that this can go part of the way, perhaps, but it doesn't really do much for natural evil, especially the cruelty that's just ripped throughout nature, throughout the animal kingdom, which I think is probably one of the most powerful aspects of the problem of evil. Soul building. I think Richard Swinburne probably does the best job of this. His kind of intricate theodicy. My response to this is that I think although there are, I think, some goods you get in a world like ours that you wouldn't get in a more perfect world, like the challenges and becoming courageous and overcoming obstacles and so on. I do think those challenges are greatly lessened by the artificiality of the idea that God created them just to give us challenges. I think that's sort of makes it some kind of game show or something. And
we talked about this last time. It's giving me flashbacks.
We had talked about that last time. And ultimately, I mean, what is really original about Swinburne's view actually is he thinks not just about what would be a better world, but about what God has the right to do to us to create that better world. And it's interesting that he takes that seriously. He takes Swinburne takes God to be subject to moral imperatives. And I suppose I find that part least compelling of his response. I just think it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to use us in this way, even if in some sense it does create better consequences. So we don't want to be too consequentialist about this, even if it is in some sense there are some goods we'd miss out on. We've got to ask, would an all-powerful being have the right to subject us to these horrors to bring about those goods?
So what about the natural law, the natural law theodicy that says that we've got to have some order in the world, and that order can manifest itself in the way, in the laws of nature, so to speak. And so when it comes to like natural evil, then the reason why that happens is because we've got to have a world that is orderly in order to actually be responsible for our actions, and to be able to weigh the consequences of our actions. We have to have an orderly world. There's another Swinburnian idea as well. What are your thoughts on that theodicy?
Yeah, again, most of these I feel there's some force to it, but it always seems to not capture everything. I mean, again, why create us through natural selection? Not sure it addresses the hiddenness of God so much, and I just can't escape the sense that everything feels so so sort of artificial. It's like a setup to see if we can pass this test before we get on to the next stage. Why not? It would seem more natural to me. Why not just spend eternity contemplating God's infinite majesty? If that's what we're supposed to do in the afterlife anyway, why not cut to the chase? Why give us this kind of weird test bit first? It seems, I don't know. And I mean, also another thing Swinburne acknowledges is, why does it have to be so bad? Okay, maybe you could make a bit of a sort of adventure playground setup where you don't get everything too easily. But I don't know. The Holocaust, the 50-year apartheid in Palestine. This seems, and it's that it's so unevenly distributed. Of course, we never many of us never experience the horrors that go on in other parts of the world.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of the free will theodicy, is because there's a question of like, has God given us too much free will? And the example that I use, that I've heard other philosophers use, is like, suppose that I gave my son, he's 4 years old, I gave him the freedom to wield one of our kitchen knives. It's like, it seems like I've done something wrong, right? It's like the intuition there is like, I've given him too much freedom. And so the question is, has God given us too much freedom in giving us free will and the freedom to do really bad, horrible things? Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why I'm not the biggest fan of the free will theodicy.
Yeah,
I
think there's something to these, but I think I would expect on this kind of hypothesis that there would be like a much more milder adventure playground setup. Much more, it wouldn't be, as you say, just all at once. And of course, I mean, the hiddenness of God is one big factor. I heard William Lane Craig on his podcast recently say, there's no good reason to think that there are any atheists who don't want to be atheists. And I thought, that just sounds to me like a very implausible claim about human psychology. I think I know lots of atheists who would like to believe, but honestly don't think the evidence is there, or are just in a culture that's kind of very secular and they just assume that, Richard Dawkins is right or something. And I feel I can be very confident about that claim about human psychology, that lots of atheists would like to be theists, but genuinely, think the evidence isn't there, and would be theists if God's existence was a bit more evident. So sorry, it's a bit of a scattergun approach here of lots of different considerations.
Yeah, no worries. I'm really eager to get to the fine-tuning discussion. So we've got some evidence. I mean, and I was about to say I'm willing to grant that we've got some evidence against perfect being theism, but I like the comparative approach. I like to look at how likely is the data given theism, how likely is the data given naturalism, or whatever theory that you're actually comparing with. And on the naturalistic hypothesis, I don't really see that we're getting an expectation the same evil and suffering. So I'm hesitant to say that we're actually we've got some evidence that favors naturalism over theism. I'm hesitant to say that, even if this data is surprising. I think it might just be surprising on both hypotheses. And so maybe we've got to take the Goff approach and find a theory that sort of gives us a high expectation of both of these. Okay, well, that aside, I want to get into the synthesis and how we actually might be able to make sense of the data, both sets of data, a little bit later on, because that's kind of later on in the tweet. Let me pull it back up one more time. So the second part of the tweet is, the atheist is in denial about fine-tuning. All right, so atheists have been very comfortable up until this point in the stream, but now we're about to turn our sights on atheists. So why are atheists in denial about fine tuning?
Yeah, I always like to give, in my book Galileo's Errors, I always like to give a kind of think about a broader historical narrative. And the way I think about it is, I think, for about more than 100 years after Darwin, in my opinion, there was no scientific evidence for God or anything like God. Philosophical considerations might be another matter, but there was no empirical evidence. And so this really cemented in people's minds, the idea that science has ruled out God, religion and science are in opposition. And you get, Nietzsche saying God is dead, Marx saying religion is the opium of the masses, Freud saying, God is a kind of daddy substitute. And then from the 70s onwards, the evidence starts to change, and we get the fine-tuning data progressively building up, and what looks, on the face of it, by our standard Bayesian ways of thinking about evidence, incredibly strong evidence for some kind of cosmic teleology, some kind of directionality in the universe. And I just think people can't handle that change. It takes time for the culture to catch up with the evidence. The Enlightenment the Enlightenment ideal is supposed to be you follow the evidence where it leads, but I just think that's almost impossible for human beings to do. I like the anecdote of the economist Keynes. Someone said to him, "You didn't used to think this," and he said, "Well, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" But I think that's just almost impossible for human beings to do. So I think we laugh at people in the 16th century when there was the growing evidence that the Earth was not in the center of the universe, and people try to get around the evidence by postulating epicycles, that is, little extra orbits of the planets in addition to the supposed orbits around the Earth. And that didn't do it, so they postulated epicycles upon epicycles. And we think, oh, how stupid they were. But I think every generation absorbs a worldview and becomes incredibly emotionally attached to it. And, it becomes part of their identity and their sense of who they are. And so I think, what we're finding now from the scientific community with respect to consciousness and with respect to fine tuning is the analog really of the anti-Copernican backlash of those early days of the scientific revolution. It's just a cultural difficulty following the evidence where it leads.
So just like we did with the problem of evil, how we kind of looked at some theistic responses to evil, what about some atheistic responses to the fine-tuning argument? Let's start with the Theanthropic Principle. Why don't you think that's a good explanation?
Yeah, so it's the Anthropic Principle, sort of, which is, I guess, what the principle that we wouldn't have, we couldn't have observed a universe that was not fine-tuned, because obviously if it wasn't fine-tuned, if it wasn't life-conducive, we wouldn't be around to observe it. And so that's supposed to say that it's not surprising. We shouldn't be surprised because we couldn't have seen anything different. Now, that's something that can kind of feel like it makes sense at first, but I think we're lucky that we've got Bayes' theorem, we've got our mathematically precise ways of understanding evidence, and when you just look at the argument in Bayesian terms, it's just really hard to see why the hell this makes any difference, right? How does it work? Very, very roughly. Again, what kind of evidence would you expect? What kind of data would you expect on a hypothesis? How likely is fine-tuning on some kind of chance hypothesis? Incredibly unlikely. If we look at the physics, how likely is it on some kind of teleology or design hypothesis? Not that unlikely, right? So it supports something goddish over a chance hypothesis. Now you add in the selection effect or the anthropic principle, we couldn't have observed a non-fine-tuned universe. So what? What doesn't change the probabilities? It doesn't change anything about the argument. So it's just sort of irrelevant, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Now, what about the multiverse hypothesis? That there's possibly infinitely many. There's string theory, according to string theory, maybe 10 to the 500 different types of universes that might exist, and we just happen to live in one of these that are, one of the universes in the multiverse that permits life. What are your thoughts on the multiverse response?
Yeah, so I guess this is the most popular response. I mean, many scientists and philosophers do think this is obviously cries out for explanation. You can't just, deny it as much as some people try. But there is the thought is this is alternative explanation. So what I've been keen to press is something that has been discussed by philosophers of probability for decades now, but is almost unknown outside of that obscure bit of academia, which is that there's pretty good reason to think the inference from fine-tuning to a multiverse is just a fallacious inference. It's an example of what we call the inverse gambler fallacy. So the classic case of the inverse gambler fallacy goes as follows. You walk into a casino, you see someone rolling a 666, you think, oh, wow, that's a really good roll. There must be lots of people in this casino rolling tonight. And the thought is, if there's lots of people rolling, I've just seen someone roll a 666. If there's lots of people rolling, you're more likely to get a 666. That's uncontroversially a fallacy because all you've observed is one roll, and no matter how many other rolls are going on, it doesn't make it any more likely that the one roll you've observed would be a 666. That the odds are 1 in 36, like any other individual roll. So that's a fallacy. Now, the challenge for the multiverse theorist is to say why their inference doesn't commit the same fallacy. On the face of it, it looks like it, right? We look, oh wow, this fine tuning's really improbable. There must be loads of other universes with crap numbers, right? We won the cosmic lottery, our numbers came up, so there must be lots of other universes with bad numbers. Well, it looks like the same fallacy. We've only ever observed one universe, and no matter how many other universes there are, it doesn't make it any more likely that our universe, the only one we've observed, is going to get the right numbers. So what's different between those two cases? What's standardly given is people bring back the anthropic principle here, the selection effect. The trouble is, once you add a selection effect to these examples of the inverted gambler's fallacy, the fallacy just doesn't go away. So it just doesn't look like the selection effect makes any difference here. So my own example is the case of Jane. So Jane was, let's say, conceived through IVF, and as an adult she finds out something strange about her conception, that the doctor who was doing the IVF had a nervous breakdown, and so weirdly decided to throw dice to decide whether to fertilize the egg, and determined only to do it if all five sixes came up when she rolled 5 dice. Fortunately they did. Jane was conceived. So Jane finds this out. This looks like a selection effect, right? Just as we could not have observed a universe that wasn't fine-tuned, Jane couldn't have found out that anything less than 5 sixes were rolled, because if the doctor hadn't rolled 5 sixes, the doctor wouldn't have fertilized the egg. Jane wouldn't have come to be. So the question is, would it be a valid inference for Jane to infer the many doctors hypothesis? So I should add part of the story with her doctor, that we know the doctor only did it once. She got some therapy, never did it again, right? Just as in the inflationary multiverse story, each individual universe only sets its constants once. So that's the perfect analog there. So the question is, can Jane make the following inference? There must be many other doctors rolling dice to decide whether to perform IVF. I think everyone agrees that's pretty clearly a fallacious inference, and yet it looks like the perfect analog of the fine-tuning, right? Jane, it's a fallacy because all she knows is that something about her birth, that the doctor rolled dice and got this improbable roll of the dice in her conception. No matter how many other doctors may or may not be rolling dice, it has absolutely no bearing on making it more likely that her doctor rolled all sixes. So it's just a fallacious inference. I mean, this is a huge discussion. Oh, I should say just finally, Cameron, I mean, I've wrote a few things on this, but I wrote a post this morning that Cameron's linked to, I think, just giving that the basic description of the inverse gambler's fallacy, but also going really heavy duty into the theoretical principles underpinning this, right? Because I've just kind of given you an argument from analogy, which I think is already quite powerful, but ultimately we want to get down to the theoretical principles that underpin that fallacy.
Yeah, I've got it linked in the description of this video. So what's been like the number one response, or the other, not the number one necessarily, but like what has been the best response that you've received to saying that this inference from fine tuning to the multiverse is fallacious? What's been the best response that you've come across?
That's a good question. I haven't found any convincing responses. What I've found a lot of people say, and this is the response, I don't know if I said this last time, but Tim Maudlin, the quite well-known in philosophy, at least, philosopher of physics at NYU, he and others, I discovered, he argues very, very fiercely on social media. But anyway, I thought, does this guy hate me? But people said, hey, he's like that with everybody. But I've tried to twist the Jane analogy, right? So they've tried to say, okay, but like what Jane could have reason to infer is that her doctor rolled dice many times, right? Her doctor rolled dice many times because the more times her doctor rolled dice, the more likely it is that the doctor would get all the right numbers and conception would happen. Now she could make that inference, right? If that was a possibility, but that would not be analogous to the inflationary multiverse theory, right? That on the inflationary multiverse theory, each universe has only one shot at getting its numbers, its constants fixed. So that's why the correct analogy is Jane's doctor only rolled the dice once. What Maudlin's version is analogous to is some kind of weird multiverse where our universe had multiple shots at getting fine-tuned, and you've got the guardian of the galaxy sitting there waiting for it to be fine-tuned and then saying, right, go ahead. And that's a kind of weird design hypothesis. So yeah, I think I've just found multiverse theorists struggling to work out. Not many people have said this is, a good inference. I think it's clearly not a good inference, but they try to say why it's disanalogous. And I guess I just haven't found anything yet. I suppose a better response would be to say, but look, there's independent scientific evidence for a multiverse. And I do think if there were, if we just knew there was a multiverse of the right kind, that would totally undermine the fine-tuning argument, because if the kinds of constants were varied, in a really broad way, then that would just look statistically like this is just chance that our universe is fine-tuned, right? So, but that's a very different evidential situation, right? So if we just knew that we were in a multiverse, that would undermine the fine-tuning argument. That's a different point to saying we can infer from fine-tuning to that multiverse. That's where the fallacy occurs. But people say, well, look, we've got independent evidence. Now, whilst there is speculative evidence, I'm not a physicist. I can't, come down on one side of the debate. There is speculative evidence for the inflationary multiverse, where you've got this rapidly expanding space-time, and then bubbles of universes slow down and form these separate universes within that kind of mega inflating universe. And then from string theory, we can have theoretical grounds for thinking through string theory the constants could vary. Okay, right? But there are many different ways that could go. And one possibility is that all or most of those bubble universes have fine-tuned constants. And if you take the evidence of fine-tuning in the way I think you should, otherwise it's fallacious, then I think if you go for eternal inflation, you should go for that kind of multiverse. Because if what we need to render probable is that this universe, the only one we've ever observed, is fine-tuned, then we need a conception of reality in which that evidence is rendered probable. And so we need some kind of inflationary universe where a good proportion of the universes are fine-tuned.
Do you mind if we move on?
Yeah.
Do you mind if we move on to the next part of the tweet?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, sorry. So it gets very complicated, that inverse gambler stuff.
Yeah, but we've spent about half the time so far on the suffering and evil, and then we spent about the next half of the show so far on fine-tuning. So here's the rest of the tweet. The endless ideological war between these two factions is preventing us finding a theory that can accommodate both of these data. So what is the theory that you have come up with that accounts for both of the data?
Yeah. So I think, we just need a fresh approach. I think, the things like I feel the same about the crazy responses people have to the hard problem of consciousness and, the multiverse to try and escape the fine-tuning. This seems to me kind of our generation's epicycles upon epicycles that people had to try and avoid, the Copernican revolution. So seeing as you asked me, just written this new book, which is currently under peer review. So I'm open-minded, as one should be, and I explore, broadly speaking, 3 hypotheses. One, teleological laws, as, for example, Thomas Nagel has explored in his book Mind and Cosmos, that was horribly, ruthlessly attacked, again, for these ideological reasons, I think. So the idea is of kind of laws. So we don't have a mind behind the universe. We have an impersonal universe, but we have these kind of laws with goals built into them. So life, a directionality towards life or towards value. I could spell out how we can think about those. Second hypothesis, non-standard design. We might have a bad God. We might have an indifferent God. Tim Mulligan's excellent book. Tim Mulligan is one of the few philosophers who's explored this kind of stuff in his wonderful book, Purpose in the Universe. He has a kind of... he actually goes for perfect being theology. Perfect being theism, rather. But he thinks we're objectively not that important and God doesn't care about us. Anyway, I don't find that necessarily terribly plausible, but it's a really interesting book. Or we could have the simulation hypothesis, right? Or we could have one of my personal favorites, a God of limited powers. I think a designer of limited powers who's wants to create the best universe they can, but the only way they just can't do it. They're not all powerful. So the only way they can create is from a singularity, a universe with the right kind of laws that it's eventually going to evolve intelligent life. And the designer, she knows that, it's going to cause a lot of shit a lot of bad stuff along the way. A lot of bad stuff along the way. And she's like, I know this is not ideal. It's the best I can do. It's that or nothing. So that's, or the final hypothesis is something I've explored in academic and popular work, cosmopsychism. The universe is a conscious mind that kind of fine-tuned itself. So, yeah, I'm open for all of these options. I do kind of say in the book, cosmopsychism just about wins and kind of grounds of parsimony and stuff. But I had a discussion about this with Josh Rasmussen on Christian Idealism podcast, cosmopsychism versus perfect being theism. And yeah, so I think we just need to be open-minded. We need to have the discussion. We need people who are cleverer than me to wade in. But it's just completely unexplored, I think. So I'm just trying to start a conversation.
All right, so let's now turn to some Q&A. So we've actually gotten a bunch of questions in already. So the first one I think was from Caleb P. He says, what is the best objection to your panpsychism?
What's the best objection to panpsychism? Well, the classic challenge is the combination problem. So for panpsychism, the basic idea is fundamental particles have very rudimentary forms of consciousness, and they somehow combine to make the complicated consciousness of the human and animal brain. Combination problem is, how the hell does that happen? How do little minds come together to make a big mind? I think this is a real problem on a more reductionist form of panpsychism, where, really my mind is nothing more than a complex collection of conscious particles. I'm actually more and more opposed to that kind of very reductionist panpsychist option. I'm inclined to think in some sense my mind is a strongly emergent phenomenon. And I'm open to that is because I don't think there's any empirical evidence against that kind of strong emergence. A lot of philosophers and scientists, I was at a conference this week, a wonderful conference on emergence with scientists and philosophers, and a lot of scientists, said, of course, we don't believe in spooky strong emergence. Strong emergence is like there's new causal principles over and above the laws of physics that kick in at higher levels of complexity. And a lot of scientists say, no, that's spooky. And I'm like, we have this is just an open empirical question. We've the kind of experiments that test our physics are with small numbers of particles. We've no idea whether, the laws of nature are exactly the same in very, very complex biological systems. Again, this is ideology, the zeitgeist of the moment, thinking we can dismiss certain views by calling them spooky. But so I think I'm more open to a less reductionist conception of panpsychism that I think really just avoids these kind of worries.
All right, so from Dustin Paulson, he says, are theists really not taking the problem of evil seriously, or is it that atheists aren't taking the theist responses to it seriously? C.S. Lewis is no slouch.
Thanks, Dustin. Yeah, again, the tweet was supposed to be a bit provocative. I certainly do think many theists do take the problem seriously, just as I think, many atheists, sorry, this is getting a bit boring now, isn't it? Like I'm being too nice. Too conciliatory. Many atheists take the problem of fine-tuning seriously and try and diffuse it and so on. But, personally, let me put it, I suppose I think if there were no ideology here, a lot more people would be persuaded by both of these things. There's hardly anyone who's persuaded by both of these things. They have to feel that they fit into one or other camp. And, I just think there's a lot of ideology making people think they have to go in one camp or the other. And look, my honest view is I just think these are both pretty powerful arguments. And if you don't have to struggle around to try and find clever ways of trying to avoid them, just follow the evidence where it leads.
This is kind of the reason why I wanted to have you on. It's so interesting to think about, like, the synthesis of these two pieces of evidence, because they are very strong both ways. And the question is, who is someone in denial, or is one group maybe not in denial? As a Christian theist, what I want to say is that the theists are the ones that are not in denial, right? The atheists are the ones that are in denial about fine-tuning. Well, not just about fine-tuning, but other arguments for the existence of God as well. In denial in the sense, in the sort of soft sense. It's not. We're not saying that this is not. Anyways, I'm kind of rambling at this point, but it's just this is super fun to think about. Okay, so the next one is from Shadowlink. Thank you guys for sending in these super chats. By the way, they really do help out the ministry. So Shadowlink's 26. This is from Ben Watkins. Man, that's an old picture. Wow, he looks completely different now. All right, here's what he says. He says, given cosmic values fall within a narrow range rather than wide, within natural theology, why think God wants those ranges to be narrow rather than wide?
So is this a critique of fine-tuning argument?
It sounds like it. I think so. Yeah.
I mean, so one critique, people say, well, couldn't God have done anything? Why does God have to be constrained by these things? I mean, okay, two things. I mean, one, I don't really buy that as an argument. Even if you're just defending theism with the fine-tuning argument, traditional theism, because I think one thing I want this book to be, I go through all of these objections. I want it to be the most accessible intro to Bayesian reasoning ever written. So I want it to be like really by going through these objections. So I think the response to this is, if I'm understanding it correctly, any Bayesian reasoning, you put stuff in the background knowledge. And so we can just put into the background knowledge, like the assumptions that are prior to the calculation, that we're in a kind of a universe with a certain form. What form? Well, take physics and take out all the numbers. So you just start from there. And you might say that's kind of cheating, but it's not cheating, because any other, any Bayesian reasoning has got to do that. As long as you're not cooking the books by building in something really contrived. But it doesn't seem to me that is. I mean, yeah, I listened recently to the Relay Theology's most recent discussion of the fine-tuning argument. Very interesting. But again, it's this thought, how do we know we're dealing with all possible universes, and whether whether life-conducive universes are rare in all possible universes. And that's making a ludicrous demand on the fine-tuning proponent. And you get around this problem in the same way. You just build stuff into the background knowledge. And so you start with the fact that we're in this finite set of universes, the set of universes that are just like ours, except you fiddle with the numbers. And that seems to me totally fine and inevitable. Often responses to the fine-tuning arguments, they stack up the standards of evidence so ridiculously high that you would never apply in other cases. Another common response is to say, well, how do we know future physics, the fine-tuning won't go away? And, my response to that is like, it's the definition of a bias to say, I'm going to ignore current evidence until evidence comes along that suits the view I already have. No one would say that in any other case. And yet, so it's like putting up these artificial, really high standards of proof. Like, you've got to wait for the end of physics, Anyway.
Yeah, I wanted to share some of my thoughts on this, and I'm still trying to develop them. So I'm trying to figure out the best way to put this. So in my view, it's not that God creates the ranges to be narrow. I think that's more of a necessary fact about physics. So from physics, we learn that the narrow is a very small range of values that these constants could take in order to be life permitting. So it's not that God wants to create narrow ranges or anything like that. It's more that God wants to create a life permitting universe. And so that is what God wants ultimately. Yeah. So I think this might actually be a confusing what the fine-tuning argument actually is. It's not that God wants these ranges to be narrow. I think that's a sort of necessary fact about physics.
Yeah, well, but I suppose the thought is God could have had different physics. You could imagine a life-conducive universe that wasn't fine-tuned because life didn't need to depend on these narrow numbers falling in these narrow ranges. It was a surprising discovery, right? That for life to be possible, these numbers had to fall in such a narrow range. There's a conceivable universe where there's life, but it doesn't hang on balanced on a knife edge in that way. Another thing to say, actually, this particularly doesn't apply to me because I'm not defending the omni-God, right? So it could be a God of limited powers who has no choice. That's not true of. They just have no choice in the form of physics. All their choices is just that they can fiddle with the numbers. So, or some natural teleological laws. So yeah, so in that case, it obviously, I think, isn't a worry.
Okay, so let's move on to a couple other questions, and I think we're going to close it out, so maybe a little bit early today. So here's a question from Slam RN. She says, what is a practicing atheist?
Practicing atheist. Is that I describe myself as a practicing agnostic.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm actually a churchgoer. I take my kids, and which is very rare in
What
the
church?
UK for someone my age. Anglican, kind of middle of the road
Okay.
Anglican church. But I would say I would not say I know that Christianity is true. I wouldn't even say I believe Christianity is true. Um, I would say I sort of engage with it as a possibility, and I get a lot out of engaging with this possibility. I connect to my community, I connect to my tradition, I connect to something greater than myself. So I even go as far as to say I disbelieve the most orthodox interpretation of Christianity because I don't believe in the omnigod. I think there's very good reason to disbelieve in the omnigod. So I used to, when I first returned to, I was raised Catholic, decided I was an atheist when I was 14, didn't get confirmed, upset my grandmother. And I kind of returned to religion in my early 30s. And when I did, I took it all totally metaphorically for a long time. You know, I mean, I love Christianity as a metaphor, you know, the inversion of worldly values, kind of identifying God with the sort of naked, executed peasant, you know, rather than the king in his castle. The guy who kind of hangs out with sinners and outcasts. So I took it all metaphorically for a long time. But then, you know, I discovered there are less standard interpretations of Christianity, like process theology, where maybe God isn't all powerful, maybe God isn't even personal, maybe God is pantheistic or panentheistic. And so I've gone from being a sort of disbeliever to an agnostic. I've gone from taking it as a metaphor to taking it as a possibility, and that's what I do.
Would you say that Pascal's Wager has anything to do with you going to church or anything?
Yeah, something in that ballpark, but maybe it's not. Look, there are a lot of even conservative Christians who take this what's called nondoxastic approach to faith. That perhaps often it goes with the view that historically it's a historical mistake to think faith is the same as belief in the modern sense. At least if you think of belief as high confidence that a proposition is true. So a lot of quite conservative Christians, William Alston. Forgotten the other names now, but so say I have faith in Christianity, but faith isn't about belief. Think high confidence is true. It's about trust, engagement, having your heart in something. And Karen Armstrong's argued that this is really what faith was historically. I'm not a historian. I don't know how good those claims are, but yeah, she says, like pistis in the Bible meant something like having your heart in it. If you look at how Jesus talks about faith, it's people who really are committed to something, have a lot of, I can't think of the word now, commitment, religious commitment. And then with the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation, we attach this new meaning to belief, like endorsement of a proposition. And then you think, oh God, Jesus really cares about what your theory of reality is, what propositions you assent to, and salvation depends on it. Anyway, I don't know what to make of that historical argument. But yeah, so it's something like Pascal's Wager. It's something like, well, Pascal's Wager is usually understood as something more akin to belief. It's more like, I'm going to engage with this possibility. I'm going to work with it. I'm going to allow it to deepen my spiritual life.
I was just going to say that there are the modern people. You need to look into Liz Jackson, first of all. Do you know who she is? Have you heard about her?
No. I'll write that down.
She talks on faith and Pascal's Wager, so you'd be really interested. And I've interviewed her on the channel as well, so she'd be really cool. I mean, modern conceptions of Pascal's Wager, they don't necessarily entail beliefs, so you don't necessarily have to have these beliefs about Christianity in order to do the wager. The wager is more about commitment, so it's more about committing to, and basically just like kind of like what you're doing, exactly what you're doing. That's why I was asking, like, is there any kind of like Pascalian type reasoning going on here? Because you can just like commit yourself to. You could even pray. You could pray in the sense of like, God, if you're there, blah blah blah, and you can go to church. You can develop these relationships and fellowship, and there's a lot of things you can do without the belief component, and it doesn't entail that you're like manipulating yourself or anything like that because of the wager, right? So I thought that was
Yeah, I'll chase that up. I mean, I just think these matters are so uncertain, and you know, you've got to live your life and have a risk either way. William James's paper, the will to believe, is another great one on this. And I mean, a lot of Jewish people, I think, uh, live like this. You know, very agnostic, maybe even atheist, but engage with the tradition and the community. I suppose I'm sort of the Christian equivalent of that.
Okay, one more question. Another one from Slam RNN. She says, "Could socialism and Christianity work together? Is this something that you've done work on?"
Well, just I guess I'm a socialist. I've written a few things on why high taxes are a very, very good idea. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, Christianity, as I think about it, is fundamentally love. You know, caring for the poor, inversion of worldly values, identifying with the peasant. If you read the bit of the gospel, bit of the Acts of the Apostles that was read out at my wedding, the early church, you know, held everything in common. Each was given according to need. Sounds a bit like Marx. You know, yeah, I think, you know, to me, Christianity, I wouldn't go so far as to say socialist, but is fundamentally very, very political. You know, our Lord is the peasant who is executed by the emperor, as opposed to the Emperor Caesar. You know, there's a fundamentally political story there.
So one more question. I was looking through the live chat to see if there was any other questions, and this one caught my eye, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it. From Colton Cawthon. He says, "Philip, I would really be curious to hear how you think moral realism and theism relate."
I am a moral objectivist, and I guess I'm not convinced that we need to move beyond Platonism, though, to get moral objectivity. I guess that you can maybe make some kind of case thinking about moral knowledge. You know, how kind of Bayesian argument. How plausible is it that we'd have moral knowledge in a sort of meaningless universe? Although which podcast was I talking about this? What's it? Parker's
Pensies.
Yeah. We talked about this. I guess I think I've got this kind of Aristotelian Platonism view that maybe we don't have time to go into, but I guess I think there are ways of making sense of both the metaphysics and the epistemology of strong realism without any kind of anything goddish. But
yeah, I want to talk about that so bad right now. The moral knowledge argument. So do you think that, like, because I think the way that I've heard it spelled out is that basically there's too much luck involved with the Darwinian picture of how moral knowledge might have come about. So how do you respond to that? Do you like try to rule out the luck being there? Because most epistemologists these days, that's what Gettier pointed out, is that when you introduce luck into the equation, you no longer have knowledge. So in the case of natural selection and everything, it seems like there's a whole lot of luck that would be involved there to give us our moral beliefs.
Yeah, I definitely think, look, I would deny that. Where I would get off the boat is that, our beliefs are wholly the product of natural selection. I mean, maybe this comes from the strong emergence stuff that I think we are. I think moral properties are instantiated in the world in something like an Aristotelian sense, and we are acquainted with them, and we respond to that understanding that our acquaintance with them affords us. So that whole picture is inconsistent with the kind of micro-reductionist picture that dominates our culture at the moment, where basically everything's reducible to physics, and then we're just kind of survival mechanisms. And moral epistemology is very hard in that picture, but I don't have that picture. I think we evolved largely through natural selection, but I think once we've got evolved conscious, I'm a panpsychist, so I think consciousness is there all along. I think I've got this pan-agentialist picture where I think the roots of free will are there at the base. And so once you get complex conscious creatures that, this is all in my new book actually as well, this pan-agentialist. Once you've got complex creatures that can have conscious understanding and include an acquaintance with moral properties and can freely respond to that knowledge and that acquaintance, then you run from there. And that's a major impact on what influences our moral development. It's not just natural selection. Other things kick in when you get complex conscious creatures.
Since we mentioned him, I'm gonna just pull this comment in here. Parker's Pensies, he said, "Is this a great channel?" To be honest, he's talking about his own channel. But yeah, no.
Oh yeah, I think he's talking about this. Yeah,
Parker's
really
great.
That chat. I recommend it.
All right, I think that's gonna do it for us. I mean, this was kind of like I randomly saw your tweet and I was like, I just want to talk to you about this on the channel. I think that it would be a lot of fun, and your ideas make me think a lot, and it's been great. It's been exactly how I was expecting it to go. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Cameron. Well, yeah, it's really nice to chat, and appreciate the conversation, and hope we can continue. And it's been a really nice chat. Yeah,
I feel like, and maybe I'm like the only one on this side of things, but I feel like if I lived in the UK or something, like we would go hang out.
Absolutely.
We should.
Have you ever been to the UK? You got any plans to come to
the UK? We went on a vacation where we went to London, Rome, and France.
London, no one ever goes to the north. The north is the most beautiful part of England, and everyone just goes to London and then Scotland and misses out the north. And
Durham, I do want
to. It's the Uxbridge of the north here in Durham. It's Harry Potter land. It's beautiful, historic town, and yeah, everyone should come visit. Come visit sometime.
Okay, all right, maybe we will. Maybe we'll have like one of our. We host these conferences every year, so maybe one year we'll do it up there or in the UK or something.
Oh yeah, invite me to your conference. I'll come to your conference.
Okay, awesome. All right, man. Well, yeah, no, it's been great, and I'm really looking forward to interacting more with your work on Twitter and following you and responding and everything. So again, thanks for coming on. I'll see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. So see you guys later. Remember, Christianity is true. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work,